Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 34th video in our Master Series and the 4th video in our first phase processing. Tonight we are going to revisit a couple things and we are going to go directly into sound sculpting in the video after this. But I just wanted to go through basically what I rechecked. Some of these things I rechecked because they should have been done in an editing phase, but I might have gotten some tracks from somebody and not gone through the editing phase of them, so I kind of keep them on here. I've debated on removing them a few times, but I always check them off just to make sure that I hadn't got something that I didn't do editing on and go, oh, I should better do that. So anyway, the first thing was cleaning up unneeded content, and we went through that in Master Series 30 in the editing phase 17, and going through cleaning up unneeded content. So we went through that, so revisit that video. Do pre-processing tests. Now, we talked about that on the introduction to this first phase processing in Master Series 31, but basically that we had talked about making sure when we do a capture that, like, since this is a vocal, that we have the vocals give us a note, an ah, or something that we can test processing on, because it's much easier to hear it on that, what you're doing, and if you're actually doing good to it, than sometimes in a performance where he's jumping around all over the place and make it sometimes hard to really hear well what's happening. Where in something like a test note or something like that, or a few notes or something, doing different things, high notes, low notes, or whatever, just, you capture those when you capture the performance that you can test processing on, because you can hear it a lot more clearly. So we wanted to kind of revisit that. And doing room response countermeasures. Now, we went through this in the editing phase when we were talking about, we went through this in the editing phase when we were dealing with filtering, I do believe. But this was, I think, Master Series 19, we talked about it a little bit. But we talked about it when we were talking about taking your room into consideration, and I do believe in Master Series number 3 that normally I'll go through, there's a few things you can do, and I talked about it there, so you might want to revisit that video. High and low pass filtering things, deverberation from something like RX, denoise will sometimes help a little bit. ADSR tools to try to cut off tails to reduce, sounds of reverberations that are mudding whatever capture you had. If you've done everything we've talked about so far, you probably don't have too much of an issue with that. But if you revisit those videos I was talking about, that sometimes you get some things that you have to clean up. There's too much reverb in it. It's too muddy, and you got to figure out some way to clean it up. We talked about a few ways to do that, but most of the time when I get it, I will get into RX6, and it's one of the reasons why I bought this piece of software, is because deverb, I can actually reduce the reverberation spatialization of the track to try to clean it up, because I don't want it conflicting with whatever reverberation I might be doing on it later. So it's a step that I always go through to see if I need to do that. And this is one of the purchases I had recommended because of what a good job it does in doing that. So after that, we revisit denoise. Now, denoise, we talked quite a bit about doing denoise when we started talking about editing. And when I was talking in Master Series 19, some more advanced tools for doing that, because I'll use MATLAB, which is a mathematical laboratory, and RX6 for doing that. They have some plugins in there for doing denoise. There's one, we had talked about them, there was a couple of them. The first one was debleed, which is really good, that you can actually bleed out noise out by putting a noise file on there to help clear out some of the noise on the file. We talked about things like dehum. We talked about all these types of things. But for the most part, it was spectral denoise. And they have a great plugin on here that will actually reduce noise on the actual file. Now, if you do a good job, of everything we've talked about so far, you may not have to worry about it so much. But sometimes I've got things I recorded a guitar or some things going on, and for some reason it just sounds a little noisy, and I want to clean it up a little bit. And these tools will do a great job of doing it. So I just kind of wanted to revisit that a little bit. We've already talked about that in editing, but I'll go back and revisit that just in case. So basically, after that, there's a couple other things. We've already dealt with phase issues in editing, but I'm revisiting that. And we in there's a video on my channel because I'm not going to make a separate video on here. There is two videos called C50 Clarity Guides. There's two of them, and those videos you should look at. The first video is more about cutting down your impulse responses and adjusting them, the frequency response and the impulse response, by actually cutting them down and working on them with an equalizer. And the second video is about trying to clean up your tracks, so that, because if things have too much tail out from them, that it can cause mud. And there's two different guides. One of them is set up for like audio and music, and one of them is for like, speaking and things like that, narration kind of type of deals. And you're basically trying to cut out detrimental reflections that are going to cause mud, and ways to do that so that when you start to add what reverb you want on there, it's going to add what you want on there, if you want any on there, and trying to cut out anything that isn't, so that it doesn't cause your mix mud. It's a huge thing, because when you get a direct sound, you get early reflections, maybe not all of them. In narration and things like, they talk about 50 milliseconds of useful reflections, and everything else is trying to get cut out because it causes muddiness. In music, sometimes it'll go up to like 80 milliseconds and things like that. But if you watch those two videos, it addresses that really well. And I go through and do that with these tracks that was talked about in those videos, to try to increase clarity if it's an issue. If it's an issue, I'm evaluating, I'm looking at it, I'm going, okay, I got to evaluate that, and I've got to clean it up some. There's too much reverberation, or there's too much tail going on, and I got to start breaking it down, so the whole thing from the hit to the end of the tail is of so many milliseconds, to where that it's increasing clarity rather than a lot of detrimental reflections coming in later that's going to just cause mud in the mix. So review those videos, and it would help you a lot. It helped me a lot increase clarity in things that I was doing when I needed. The next thing is tuning. Tuning is a really simple thing. People get all wrapped up in tuning. Even in your DAW, you can go in there and find a little section that's having an issue, cut it out, duplicate it, or cut it, duplicate it, drag it onto another track, loop that area, and in your DAW you should have like, areas where you can tune, pretty minute and minuscule amounts of tuning that you can tune this, like put it on this track and then loop it after you've taken this part here that you duplicated, and mute it. Use a mute tool or something on it to try to mute it so it doesn't play back, so you only hear this one down here in conjunction with what was coming after this that you cut and put it down here. And you can actually tune it up or down. I mean, most of the time it's minuscule tunings that you can do in the DAW. If it's all over the dang place, there's a problem. I mean, it's going to be a pain, or you're going to have to use something like Melodyne or some other auto-tune type of plug-in. But hopefully you're not having those big issues. Hopefully it's right here, right? This one note, and I just need to adjust it up or down a little bit. Cut it out, do that, and then after that, remove this piece here, and then drag this piece up here once I've rendered it with whatever tuning I've done to it. And it's normally not that big of a deal, unless you have serious issues that, you're going to have to get out something like Melodyne. Now, I'm not going to make a whole video on using any specific plug-in, but we're going to talk about the importance of it. I'll normally use Melodyne myself, because when I'm doing it, I've figured out that I like Melodyne for a couple different reasons. The first thing was that it's very simple. Mine is real simple, and I didn't buy the elaborate $10,000 version of Melodyne, because normally if the track's that messed up, it's getting re-recorded, or I tell them I'm not fussing with it, because it just causes issues. Does that make sense? Sometimes not. It's just a little bit of fine tuning sometimes. But these plugins will work great. I've found that I'll be going along and I've got one note here or somewhere that's just so slightly out of tune. I mean, it's not much. It's just, it needs to come up or down just a little bit, And the piece of software, this is just the basic version of Melodyne that I got with my DAW, and it does that fine. I don't do elaborate tunings. If I got that many problems with it, and I'm like, listen, bro, I'm not fussing with that. I'm not. I mean, if it's a really good performance, and for some reason there's something screwed up somewhere, then I'll fuss with it up, some. But I found this takes care of that easily, and these pieces of software are great. So I'm not going to get into too much of the uses of them because it's going to take some reading on your part and you're going to have to investigate it. What we're going to talk about is actually getting the tuning done and it being a step in your processes, because the importance of it is more important than exactly how you're going to get it done, other than just a real simple step in your DAW like I was trying to show you there. When you get into the more advanced software, you're going to have to read about them and then take the precautions that they tell you and listen for audio anomalies. That's going to be your biggest thing, that it starts warping the audio and so that you can't fix it. Does that make sense? And so you got to be real careful of that. Sometimes you can mask it in the mix if it does a little bit, but you got to be real kind of careful of that. But the importance of it and checking it is important, because if you go through a production and if it was a good performance and you did a good capture and you did a great job editing, but you've got like a couple notes across there that are off just a little bit, I mean, not much, I mean, they might be off just a little bit, it can make or break the production. So you really need to have it a step in your processes to go through and really listen to it and really listen to problem issues that you're having and go, well, that note is off. And sometimes if I'm not hearing it quite right and I don't have a mix, I'll go through and listen to it and throw like a MIDI keyboard on there or something, and I'll listen to the notes and I'm like, and I'll go, well, I think it's happened here. So I'll actually get out my MIDI keyboard, open up a track, and meet, is that light close? Is it off? Because I'm like, what's going on there? And you got to be real careful, because sometimes it's part of the performance, but most of the time you're trying to get to areas that are notes that are being held or for any length of time, because anything else can just get washed away a lot of times. Because if you've got something like, let's say you've got something right here and the guy goes something like that, well, this crap that's going on before there might be able to fly. I mean, it might be not quite in tune or in key or whatever, but it's just kind of going up, and then that note you're worried about. So you're worried about where he hits that spot, and that's where you're worried about, where you really have to have concern, and you really want to cut that there. You can always, undo later or something, make sure you cut at zero crossing, and make sure that's in tune. That other crap coming up to it may be not that important, but that note being held for any length of time will be. Or staccato notes that are and they're stepping, in key somewhere. Or if he's, stepping out of key for a minute for something he's doing, it can be very important. So when you're getting and messing your tuning, you got to kind of take that into consideration and understand that the performer, he might not have been wanted to be in key. So if he was stepping out of key to do some weird crap that was, like a melodic minor run over a G major that, that he thought was cool, you don't want to get in there and auto tune it, bro. I mean, you just don't want to do that. It will cause a problem. You wonder what the hell you were doing, because it was like all of a sudden he sounds like, Barbra Streisand or something. He was not shooting for that. So it's an important step, but it's not usually that difficult. Your DAW normally have sufficient tools to deal with a decent performance. If you've got a horrible performance and you've got problems all over the place and you have to pull out a specific piece of software to deal with it, well, I mean, it's one of those kind of things that you just have to fuss with it. I've found that the software works great, but I've run into audio anomalies. I've run into issues with, the quality and things like that. So just be careful. So I just wanted to talk about tuning a little bit, the simple concept that it is, and something you just need to take into consideration so that, you can get in there and do a little bit of fine tuning on it, and a couple examples of how to get it done. Most of the time, like I said, I use my DAW, or sometimes I'll go into Melodyne. And the software is not that difficult to use. Just be real critical and take the time to do a good job to make sure all the notes are in tune where they're supposed to be, so that you can so it comes out and doesn't cause your production a serious problem. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next video when we start actually doing some sound sculpting.